Hello and welcome back to Humanity Rising and our series on time and the weird nature of time. Good morning, Shannon. Good morning. Good afternoon from the Netherlands, and to everyone else who is out there. So we're, as Jim and I have said on other mornings, really this question of science and consciousness is helping us to bridge the gap between, let's say, a Western scientific mindset and then an understanding of the nature of consciousness as being that which connects everything. And weird was the original Anglo-Saxon, Celtic, Viking term for the web of interconnectedness that generates all life. And so we've been kind of bringing that meme back to life, as it were, as in an attempt to help people to rediscover that interconnectedness. And time and our relationship to time is an absolutely critical piece of that. The kind of in our mainstream society now is focused and experiences the world primarily as linear in terms of time. In fact, very few people would question the whole concept of linear time. Whereas when you look at our history, we actually see that linear time as an experience and a concept is quite a new concept, that we haven't always experienced time that way. So part of what we're going to explore in this Science and Consciousness session, and which we're going to go, of course, much deeper into at the Science and Consciousness event in November, is how has our experience of time evolved over time, if we take a linear perspective on it. And I'm going to share a few thoughts around that. And then delighted to have with us Calen Rayne and Chris Stanley. And Calen will talk about, as I end on our latest experiences and understandings of time, and how we can integrate the linear and the non-linear aspects of time. Calen will share a few of his thoughts on what that looks like from his perspective when we start to operate in that different time dimension. And Krista will share in particular her experiences of working in that time dimension through her mediumship and other practices. So Calen and Krista, why don't you just turn your videos on for a moment to say hi, and nice to have you with us. And I'll dive in and share a few thoughts first, and then we'll come back to you. So this, what I'm going to share with you comes from a little course I did on time as part of the Merry Musings series. And I'm just going to share a few of these thoughts shortly to get us going in terms of our understanding and reflections around this question of time as linear and or non-linear. Excuse me 1 second, my take a break system is telling me to take a break, so I think I should probably just turn that off for now. And I just wanted to share, where I was drawing some of this from, a few of the different books that inspired my thoughts on time and this inquiry. Some of them you might recognize, some of them you might not, but I'll quote from them as we go through. So the kind of starting point for me on this is the idea that as our understanding of the world has co-evolved with the life conditions that we have grown up in, so our experience and understanding of time has co-evolved. And what you can see in front of you on the screen at the moment is based on the spiral dynamics model of psychological development at the individual and collective and societal level over time. And looking on the left side, you'll notice that 1 and 2, the kind of lower two systems on the scale, have the word internal next to them. And then the central 4 have external, and then the upper 2 have internal next to them. What that's pointing to is a basic kind of starting point for our experience of reality. And those first 2, the beige and the purple, the 1 and the 2 down the bottom, when we were living in those times, we experienced time primarily as cyclical. So it was a period pre-rational, before we developed the sense of separate self, before we created that separation, before we started to explore the nature of time being linear. So when I say linear time is a recent phenomena, it really is, if you think about the amount of time we've been here on the planet. As for a long time, millions of years, we didn't actually experience it as linear, we experienced it as cyclical, which when I first came across that kind of blew my mind, because I was, oh wow, you mean linear time isn't a pre-given of life in the universe? It's like something that we've come up with or experienced more recently. And so that David Bohm quote at the top, time is a theory, and the whole bar is in the way at the top, so I can't see it properly. But that the link to the psychology, time being a psychological concept rather than a pre-given of the universe, is really key to these ideas that I'm going to share. And so that those early 2 phases moved into this sense of separate self as the kind of psychological ego developed, as it were, as we individuated and we started to see differences between things. And for a long time, in fact, still primarily, that led to a relationship and an experience of time as being more linear. It was correlated with the establishment of farming, when we planted things for reward later on. So when we were just hunter-gathering, it was food for now. With farming, there was a linearity to the process that enabled us to to plan better in a linear time. So it's not about a better or a worse, but what did happen at that point, and this is at the core of my whole Volution theory that was my ubiquity PhD, is that in a healthy development, we would have transcended and included those earlier 2 phases, integrated the experience of interconnectedness and the cyclical nature of time into our linear capacity as we developed. And unfortunately, in Western civilization, we transcended and repressed those earlier phases, which meant that the linearity evolved out of context of the interconnectedness and the cyclical nature, which, as many of you will know if you've heard me talk about this before, is, I believe, the cause of so many of our challenges today. So we've had this phase of an experience of time as linear. What we're starting to push into now, as you'll have heard from many of the speakers this week, particularly if you think about Donna and what she was saying about the childlike nature of time and how we dismiss that really in our current civilization. That childlike nature of relationship to time is related to those early 2 phases there, the kind of pre-rational phases. The problem she was talking about is when not so much the emergence of linear time itself, but when we deny the existence of another dimension of time that has actually been part of our own developmental path individually and collectively in our lives. And so what we're pushing into now is a realization we need to reintegrate that experience and understanding of the cyclical time. And then we come into what I call volutionary. So rather than evolution or involution, which are very linear concepts, volution means to spin. So it's the integration of the linear and the cyclical. That looks a bit like a torus in terms of its movement. And often people might talk about translinear, but again, you're defining that in relationship to the linear. So I prefer volutionary because it sets in, it's a new term really that points to the integration of the two. So what I'm going to share with you now is just a few kind of quotes and descriptions of what time was like at the cyclical, at the linear, and now pushing into the volutionary experience. So these pre-rational phases, we think and we talk about in our languages future being ahead of us and the time being behind us. Well, that's not always the case in every culture. In Aymara, in the Andes, they point forward to the past where they can see it, right? Because they've experienced it, and they point backwards behind themselves for the future. different experience or concept of time. The Hopis actually have no structure in their language for past and future tenses. It's all in the present tense. Everything is ing. Everything is happening now. There is no structure for past and future. The Aboriginals think of time moving geographically east to west. And Mandarin speakers will think about above for earlier and below for next. So there was and still exists in many of these cultures a very different relationship to time than the one that in the industrialized world we assume is the norm. And when we push into the rational, there's a nice quote from Gleit from his book on time. It says, without sequential time, thought, which is a process, is hard to imagine. Consciousness requires time, it seems. It requires being in time. When we think, we seem to think consecutively, one thought leading to another, in timely fashion, forming memories all the while. A God outside of time would not have memories. Omniscience doesn't require them. So at the same time that our experience of linear time emerged, the whole idea of thought, of rational thought, emerged as well as we developed that sense of separate self. So there were all these kind of core conceptual experiences that emerged for us around the same time as humanity. And Schlein in The Alphabet and the Goddess points to this, the fourth commandment, which he says sacralized the sequential nature of time in terms of how it emerged and how it was embedded in our culture. The monasteries went further and created the most characteristic feature of Western culture, repeatable, linked segments of time. It was in Christian monasteries that the seamlessness of the day first fragmented into hours and minutes. By spacing prayer services at precisely punctuated intervals, the abbots compelled the monks to acclimate to man-made units of time. And interestingly enough, the first Coggan-gear clock that could divide an hour into minutes was installed at the monastery at St. Albans in 1348 and was used to bring people to prayer at those specific moments. So we can see how the shift from a more cyclical experience of time moved into this linear kind of experience of time being separated into pieces that were connected up and embodied particularly through religion. Another Schlein one, linking the sense of time to the convention of currency, right? Having money or coin. Possessors of coin understand they have only postponed to a later time the pleasure of holding gold in their palm. So a worthless coinage such as copper round coins that we all used to have, although it's now digital a lot more, represent delayed gratifications. When we have a coin, we know and we trust that later on we'll be able to swap it for something that we can actually use or consume. Only a population immersed in a linear alphabet culture could have conceived of the equation time is money. So time thought, separation in space, currency, all of these things emerging at the same time. Justice, says Schlein. The time commandment lays the ground for the idea of justice, since a well-developed sense of linear time is necessary to conceive of punishment delayed and reward postponed. Non-literate people are not as preoccupied with the notion of justice as the alphabet literate counterparts, because they do not conceive of time only as linear. A judgment day occurs only in literate cultures. Non-literate people tend to conceive of death as a passage to another world, not as a day in court. Alphabets stretch out the sense of time and make its users more aware of the possibility of retribution at a date in the future. So people who become alphabetically literate also become aware of the possibility of writing history, the chronological sequencing of events. So again, a reminder, wow, here's another core concept, in our industrialized culture of justice tied again into this experience of time as linear. So what happens when we push beyond the linear time and we look to try to reintegrate the cyclical, not with dismissing the linear, although you do see that tendency sometimes, but as a way to what does it mean to get beyond this experience of linear time? So a lot of the research that we also referred to before at Princeton around intention and things, or trying to understand this dimension of time, has shown that time is non-linear, that people can pick up information from somebody trying to send it from somewhere else before the person has even chosen what they're going to send. And in fact, that proved to be more effective than someone trying to pick up information at the same time somebody was sending it. So there's a whole non-linearity that seems to be going on at that informational level. And so when does this start to emerge in art in this civilization? Well, early on in the 1900s, the concept from Einstein and Minkowski, space-time, where they were saying, well, look, if you look at the past and the future, they're geometrically identical. So there's some kind of relationship here between past and future that we'd not conceived of before. And Einstein said, people like us who believe in physics, interesting, know that the distinction between past, present, and future is only a stubbornly persistent illusion. So that was coming at it from the physics perspective. And then in the 1940s, Wheeler and Feynman, of course, was also around the core of the development of quantum physics, presented an idea to Einstein at Princeton saying that particles must be able to exert their influence on other particles, not only forward in time, but also backward in time. So, what is going on there? That fundamentally challenges the linearity. Steiner, who a lot of you will recognize, says it's not the past which rules us, it's the image of the past. So this comes back to Bohm's thing about it being a psychological construct. If you think about it now, the past only exists for us in the way we relate to it now, right? Quite literally. So we only, the past, if we pick up a moment from the past, it only exists for us in the memory we have of it in the present, right? The emotional memory, the pictorial memory we have of it. So it's our image of the past, not something very concrete or specific we can call the past. Krishnamurti, for the brain to deny time is a tremendous activity, meaning a fantastic achievement of having no problems. For any problems that arise, any question is immediately solved. So when you're fully in the present and the brain isn't locked into an idea from the past or a concept in the future, then things seem to resolve themselves. As he said, God can only operate if the brain is quiet, if the brain is not caught in time. So again, if we're fully present, that's when you could say the natural intelligence or spirit or God, or however we want to frame it, is able to drop in. And Joseph Campbell was the great mythologist who explored these patterns across human civilization. Says eternity isn't a long time. Eternity has nothing to do with time. The experience of eternity right here and now is the very function of life. It's Campbell. So he's also kind of pointing to how we really bring things into the present and get beyond this idea of being locked into the concept of time. And this was just an image I got at some point. It's like, if you're refreshing your browser or you're trying to watch a sport result, and on your phone, you're continually pulling it down to refresh so you get the updated results. Feels like that's what reality is constantly doing. It's like refreshing itself in the present. Right? There's a constant kind of refresh going on. So just an image ultimately then, if we can understand how these have developed, our concepts of time have developed in this way, if we take a linear perspective on it, then we can see that these two can coexist. So there are two forms of Brahman, time and the timeless. From the Christian tradition in Corinthians, for things which are seen, so in the visible, which would be those central four value systems, external, yang-centered, whereas the bottom two and the top two are yin foundations. And it's in the external, in the yang, that we see things as object, right? For things which are seen are temporal in time, but things which are not seen are eternal. So what is important to note is that although both of the pre-rational, let's say, and trans-rational are yin-centered, there is a distinction there in that one is just the experience of presence and cyclical cycles, and the trans integrates the linearity into that as well. So Virginia Woolf's quote here: "What is more? What more terrifying revelation can there be than the present moment? That we survive the shock, it's only possible because the past shelters us on one side, the future on the other." That's a great quote. Just the fact that it's only the present, what a shock that must be for us. So I'm going to leave it there. If there is, if you want to dig into this more deeply, I'll drop the link to this session on time into the chat as well, so you can see that. And I'm going to invite Calen to just say a few words to get us going on this, what I would call the volutionary nature of time, or the kind of translinear nature of time, as you're coming to understand it in your work and experience it as well.
It may be more than a few words.
That's fine. We got plenty of time, Calen.
Cool.
And I've agreed with Calen that if I don't understand something, I'm going to, politely interrupt and ask him to explain it.
That's fine.
But if you have any questions, please drop them into the chat as well, if you're anything you want to ask more about.
Yeah, I didn't prepare any visuals for this one because some of it is on a current download and I haven't put together a PowerPoint or anything. So basically my part of the discussion is the simultaneity of time, and it has to do somewhat with twisting. Peter showed the Minkowski space-time diagram, and if you take a catenary, if you look up catenoid, C-A-T-E-N-O-I-D, it's a rotation of a catenary, but if you twist it at the same time you're rotating it, you'll end up with the Minkowski space-time image that connects the future to the past. So my training is in the Himalayas. I think a lot of people know that. And Peter Kingsley has a book called A Story Will Pierce You. And it's about a Mongolian shaman named Abras who went to Greece looking for Pythagoras in order to hand him a golden arrow. And with that golden arrow, all of the mathematics and the geometry and everything was loaded into the golden arrow, and from that came Western civilization. And I was glad Peter Kingsley wrote the book. And this is a golden arrow. I think you can see this on it's actually a perba, but it sits this way. But this is a golden arrow. So what I'm presenting today is just one of the downloads I received from a golden arrow. I was given this after my training in the Himalayas because I have a strange mathematical brain and I could put together a lot of mathematics very quickly, as Peter and Krista can attest to when we're out doing some of these projects that we've worked on together. And so my downloads come from this golden arrow. And I have the 56 years of Buddhist training. So I'll start out by saying one of the core sutras of the Mahayana Buddhism is the Avatamsaka. The central theme of the Avatamsaka is the unity and interrelation of all things and events, a conception which is not only the very essence of Eastern worldview, but also one of the basic elements of the worldview emerging from modern physics. And the reason it's important, this little part here about emerging from modern physics, this is from a paper I wrote at Naropa 30 years ago on the reality from a Buddhist quantum perspective. So I've been on this subject for a long time. And it related at that time to something I had discussed 40 years ago in a presentation to a group called the non-synchronization hypothesis of the manifestation of phenomena with regard to the senses' perception of substance as reality. And the only thing that means with all that verbiage is that if you look at a horse, in the time it took you to look at the horse and for that image of the horse to come back to your brain, it's already in the past. So you are literally, as long as you maintain your gaze, it looks like it's there. But in the moment, you're looking at something that's already not there anymore. So that's why the obsession with time has been something that I've done for well over 50 years. When we get to one of the core teachings of Buddhism, in the Tibetan Buddhism, there's a concept called Rigpa, R-I-G-P-A, if you can look that one up. And what that means is non-conceptual, thought-free, original wakefulness. And it's my understanding from the downloads I'm getting that that is the original state. And that is the place where time has no meaning. A lot of people try to reach that in meditation. You'll have moments in your life where you're going, everything is just totally clear to me. And it's totally clear because you've entered a state of Rigpa. And it's important because in my training, basically we were taught that we are nothing more than the universal mind sitting in contemplation of itself. So all of the billions of people that have lived over time are just aspects of the original consciousness or universal consciousness or the Akashic field or whatever you want to call whatever that is from your tradition. It's an aspect of that sitting in contemplation of itself. So when anything that we're doing on a meditation basis or from day to day, it's really the universal mind experiencing as it wants to experience through us. So the concept I want to put forward today is something called Rayne space-time. There are various space-times. There's Newtonian space-time, there's Schwarzschild space-time, there's Minkowski space-time. There are various types of space-time. But the one I came up with about a dozen years ago during a training by Robert Lawler was using alternating Fibonacci and Lucas numbers. And most people have some understanding of Fibonacci numbers, the golden mean spiral and all of that. And some people have looked at Lucas numbers, which are just a variation. And when I alternated them, one of the first numbers I came up with was 110 hertz. And from probably other sessions that you've had here, and one thing that we've learned at Broughton from the Princeton work was that all sacred sites have a frequency of 110 hertz. So that number is only generated by combining alternating Fibonacci and Lucas numbers. Another number that comes up during that is 555, which is, in my mind, a fifth dimensional awareness because it's 5 times 111. So 110, 111 is that frequency. And a fifth dimensional awareness, according to some sources, is a balanced state of present time awareness, which basically describes Rigpa. You're in a balanced state of present time awareness. And present time awareness is all there is. There's no past, there's no future. In my mind, we have a present time awareness of the entire board at one time. There's a new theory about space-time that's just come out. One thing to type in is twisty space-time, TWISTY. And what they've discovered is that if space-time is not curved, it also has twists in it as things move through it. So there's a twistiness to space-time. And this twistiness, as I had the little blurb about this, led me to a little bit of research about Khipus from the Andes Mountains. And if you look up Khipus, these are knots that were used for numbering. And it looks sort of like macrame when it's on the wall, but it's the knots were used and how they were knotted identified numbers, but it was also used for other kinds of information. And depending on the colors and the twists and the different locations of them on the macrame things, it provided information. So we have in the Andes Mountains a sort of a variation of the twisty space-time in that they were using knots and various twists and colors to sequence information. So each of these Khipus had a different sequence for the numbers, the knots, the colors, and all of that in order to move information along the pipeline. The same thing happens with DNA. We have DNA sequencing in order to, and depending on how much the DNA molecule has a twist to it, maybe a little variation in a twist is how we get all of the differences. So I keep seeing this twisty thing show up at different places for the movement of information. So my understanding is that everything is simultaneous. The twistiness space-time theory that they're talking about deals with teleparallel gravity, which deals with parallel lines. And in my mind, with my studies, everything is parallel. Dimensions are parallel. There are no past lives. There are no, I think this was the presentation I gave at Broughton last year, there are no near-death experiences. The experience that happens at the time of your transition is a movement back into the universal consciousness. So you're not dying, you're basically just returning to the original consciousness. So when people see the light, they're seeing the light of original consciousness, and they're just returning back to that from the aspect of existence that they are experiencing at that time on behalf of the universal consciousness. The past lives, all lives are, everything is running simultaneous and parallel. So if it's something that you're experiencing that you think is a past life, in all likelihood, you've tapped into a frequency of someone else's stream of consciousness, which we spoke about at Broughton, I think 2 years ago, or you've tapped into some part of your lineage going back to universal consciousness. I facilitate something called the Kalavankana meditation, which is an ancient Vedic meditation known as time cheating. And I had one client who, after experiencing the meditation, sat up and said, I went 4 billion years back in time until I was a speck of dust and had my first moment of consciousness. So in the case of past lives, if everyone is just experiencing what they're experiencing as an aspect of universal consciousness, again, the universal mind sitting in contemplation of itself, then it is possible to tap into those streams, because that vibration is coming from universal consciousness, moving forward in time, what we call linear time, which time is more simultaneous. It's all happening at once. I think Peter had a couple of quotes about that. So thinking anything else that I want to throw in here, and just maybe you want to ask questions or something. I know
Calen, yeah,
part of Krista's presentation, we might end up talking about Ertas, which was one of the things that came out of her dissertation that we worked on and spent a lot of time on. I think that's one thing we might want to discuss, about how the information that's traveling through the universe and how it ends up in the brain, and how it's deciphered in the brain, and how it's organized in the brain through the ERTAS, which is the extended reticular thalamic activating system, which there's a discernment process when information comes into the brain on where to place it as a new memory or an old memory. And in my training, it's not necessarily a memory, it's happening simultaneous to everything else. So there's just the one great ocean, as the Buddhists would refer to it as. So
a question just I had earlier, Calen, was you said that it was the combination of the Fibonacci sequence and the Lucas sequence that seemed to unlock these key numbers to experiencing, I guess the kind of transcendence of time. Have you got any thoughts on why that is? Why we have to combine those two? Like, what's the nature of them and their combination that seems to unlock that pattern?
On one of the presentations at Broughton's, there was over a PowerPoint of slides. It was determined that the vibration of consciousness is 466 hertz, and that's one of the numbers that comes up through the combining the alternating Fibonacci and Lucas numbers. And I think there's some Mongolian monks on the web that are chanting at a 466 hertz frequency. So in my work with the singing bowl that I use, which has the 3 kinds of sky rock or meteorite in it, that particular frequency, when I drop that in an algorithm, is one that can put someone in the state of Rigpa and allow them to move freely without being hindered by the notion of time. So it just happens that Fibonacci numbers, to me, typically if you're working on this plane of existence, Fibonacci numbers work in this world, and the Lucas numbers seem to be more ethereal or cosmic, for lack of a better term. That's not really a good description, but when I'm working algorithms, if I'm working on trying to pull stuff up in the earth, I'm using Fibonacci numbers. If I'm trying to bring sort of information from sky, from the channel, then I'm using Lucas numbers. And it just happened that by combining them, you end up with this 110, 555, and 466.
So you could say the combination of them is the interface between heaven and earth.
Yes.
The interface between this.
Yeah, the nameless religion. My training was in what's known as the nameless religion, and there's a large treatise on the web, if you just type in nameless religion, that explains. It was some people call it pre-literate Bon, but it was also known as the patterns of heaven and earth. So my training and all the tools that I have are to discern the patterns of heaven and earth, and then sacred conventions was how to work with those patterns and do adjustments to maintain a state of equilibrium or this present time awareness. And I work with a grid. The best term I've heard anybody when they were trying to figure out where I work was the primordial grid. It's not this grid. I meet people all the time that are working on ley lines, and they're doing energy work and everything that they're doing. And they ask me questions, and I'm not able to really comment on it because the grid I work on is totally different, which is the primordial grid, which exists in the state of non-conceptual thought-free original wakefulness and is the one that's connected to universal consciousness. So I'm working on a completely different grid. As you know, in 2011, we did some work on a ghost cathedral that you had identified in Chartres. And the next year, the three of us were on a little project that we were doing outside the normal class. And the intention was to have the Chartres Cathedral appear as a crop circle. And the way that would have worked was when all these altars got put up, those were put up on the primordial grid. And after the class in Wiltshire, we arrived in Chartres on Sunday morning, and the Chartres Cathedral had appeared as a crop circle overnight. And that's because it had been embedded through the series of altars I had done, which included the Chartres Labyrinth and a Black Madonna Purba and different things. Those were embedded on the primordial grid. And, you know, if we want to talk about crop circles, my theory is that those are energetic adjustments on what we would call the real grid or the real world that are done on this template on the primordial grid, working with the patterns of heaven and earth, and someone somewhere is working on those patterns. If it's not me, then it's someone else that also had this training and has tools available to them. And they might do something as sort of an acupuncture treatment on the primordial grid. And if it's deemed necessary or valuable or of assistance on this plane, then overnight, you know, they've had helicopters and planes that have flown over a field and flown back over, and during the time they went one way and came back the other way, the crop circle is there. So if it happened to have already been beneath on the primordial grid, it could have instantaneously pulled the crop.
I mean, it's really working at the interface between the non-linear time and the linear time between heaven and earth.
Yeah, nothing I do is on linear time. Yeah. You know, you two have been with me on enough places that I'm working that you can see I'm in a trance state, and I can throw an altar down with about 35 things on it in under 5 minutes, because it's just, you know, it's a focus, and the only reason I can have that type of focus is because I'm working on the primordial grid outside of linear time. Otherwise, I would be thinking about it and trying to figure out what I was doing. And you can't place 25 objects on the ground in a specific geometric configuration and design an algorithm in your head at the same time and sound a bowl, and you can explain what happened in Yorkshire when we were in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Krista, why don't you, I mean, it'd lovely to hear some of your experience of exactly what Calen just described, you know, working in that, seemingly in that space, you know, where time is of a different nature. So just tell us a little bit about, you know, the work you do and how you've experienced time in that context, and then we can kind of connect up some of the dots.
Okay. Yeah, I practice as a medium, a psychic medium. I do a lot of dream work. And so what I'm bringing to this conversation is how that practice of what you are describing conceptually actually happens. And so for me, what I have to do is I have to remove or let drop temporarily any conceptual thought. I have to open myself. I refer to it as reading the field. And in order to do it, my mind has to be completely open and receptive. And in order to do that, I cannot have concepts. It's almost like time. Linear time is embedded in our concepts. And so when you talk about, you know, I'm primarily clairvoyant, so information will flow into me oftentimes through my interior visual system. but it's also, I'm also very claircognizant, where complete ideas will drop into my awareness. And then I have to convey this to a client if I'm working with somebody. And so these snapshots are, just as you had said, Peter, they're not alive. I'm getting a picture of something and it's information that's being transferred, but then I have to move into the moment of that information. I have to let the image go so that then it opens this flow. And that's what the training and the skill is in order to do this, is you have, and meditation kind of prepares us, dream work prepares us to get into this kind of spectrum within this range of consciousness on this spectrum, to be able to hold ourselves open to a flow that then, you know, when I'm working with a client, I then have to convey what I'm saying. So what I'm seeing, so everything then moves into what Pashler had said, a gating process. In order for us to cognitize, we become linear. A has to happen before B and has to happen before C. So, for me, in my work, it's a matter of moving into the field and then allowing the information, it's going through my brain, it's going through my self model, my world model, and transmitting that information and then letting it go. It really is a process of, you know, as you say, that kind of, I've often seen you, Peter, talk about the evolution and evolution, this movement in and then letting out, and it feels like that. That's what it feels like. So also the thing that we're going to be dealing with at the Science and Consciousness Conference is this idea where precognition comes in to the the equation, and it's a large, large isn't the right word. It's a very prominent factor when you open to receive information. And oftentimes we don't recognize it until it suddenly shows itself in the material world. It crosses our path, and we're like, wait a second, I had that dream like 3 weeks ago, and here it is. Or an image or something, you've gotten a download. We get them all day long. We move in and out of, we phase in and out of this kind of open receptiveness. A daydream is a very good example of what it feels like, because when you're in the daydream, you don't know you're in a daydream. It's not until you snap out of it that things come into form or become conceptualized. We language it.
So you're really moving from this kind of the non-linear time. You have to then back into the linear time to be able to communicate it. And do you never worry or experience that what you see in the non-linear time, you then kind of lose or forget when you come back into the linear?
Yes, absolutely. That's like a big, big worry. And dreams, we experience that all the time.
Yeah.
I think, though, that it's in your consciousness somewhere. And if it's really important, it's going to come up. It's going to show itself. But we do worry about that because we so rely on our memory to guide us. And it's really not about memory when you're on the other side of the veil, essentially. You know, when you're working, it's like self, no self, and there's a virgule in between them. It's like that's where you work. You work in that in-between place, and we're constantly back and forth.
Yeah, it's very amazing how, you know, you and Calen are doing quite different things. You know, you're in the kind of mediumship, Calen working with the energies and the earth and things, and yet you're talking about a similar experience, which is this boundary between the non-linear and the linear, and how you're really needing to bring information through from, let's say, the universal field or the non-linear field into this this kind of flow of seemingly linear
Yes.
reality that we're.
When I did the training with Robert Lawler, he has it was about his new book, which was like 700 pages long, called The Geometry of the End of Time. So literally the geometry of the end of time. So if you're up for 700 pages, it's extremely interesting how he discusses from Voices of the First Day, which is his first book, going all the way to the geometry of the end of time. And his theory was that to move from known to unknown, from no meaning to meaning, from non-reality to reality, required an irrational number of some kind in order to pierce the veil. And in my mind, I have the Fibonacci numbers here, I have the Lucas numbers here, and the irrational thing to do, and this is where I came up with this, was during his class when he said that the numbers 16, 26, and 42 kept showing up in various experiments in different places, and no one knew why they showed up. And I irrationally wrote down Fibonacci numbers and Lucas numbers and started adding them, and the first few I came up with were 16, 26, and 42. And then on to the 110, 466, and 555. So at least in my work, I'm assuming that my Rayne space-time, my Rayne numbers, are the irrational numbers that allow me to pierce the veil and do the work I do.
Well, it's interesting with in our training, you know, when you train as a medium, because there's technique. You have to release from logical reasoning. You cannot get there through that mechanism of thinking. So you have to think differently. And that's where the training comes in. And that's where meditation is so powerful, and doing dream work to kind of journal and track your dreams, is because it allows you to shift from that dependence on logical, rational reasoning to make sense of things and allow yourself to be nonsensical and irrational, and allow the world to start to, or the cosmos, or whatever it is, the field, to start to come into your awareness.
Yeah, it's like we're currently running this Hack the World course, and we're doing a lot of remote perception training. And you know, what everyone's discovering, which of course people who are experienced in it know, is that you can't parallel process the analytical mind and the intuitive mind. You know, they just don't work together. They have to, when somebody's trying to send an image, or you're trying to pick up an image, you have to be completely in that receptive, intuitive mind, and just capturing whatever impression you get. You know, there's no, you can't, if you stop to try to analyze what you're getting, you lose the stream.
You lose the blend, you lose the contact, essentially. Well, and you had spoken about this integration of these earlier processes that you were speaking about. I think we're right on the cusp of that. We're right there. It's like our consciousness has gotten to like a fulcrum or an apex, I don't know what you would call it, where we're starting to be able to think in this way. And so it is this integration of this broader way of thinking, and moving us away from that strict linear, and time's the fallout on that, because time defines linear, and
and thought as well,
and it's just not a part of that. It's like you have T1 and you have T2, and which one are you working with?
The you know, there's a bunch of questions in the chat I'd like to come to, but one I'd love to ask the two of you in terms of the relevance of this to, you know, what's going on in the world today, the seeming breakdown of industrial civilization, and uncertainty about, you know, who's going to survive. Will humanity make it through this, or is Earth going to purge itself of this, what seems to be destroying, you know, a lot of the rest of the life on Earth? It seems to me that exactly what the two of you are describing, which is being able to navigate this interface between the universal field, I'd say, where everything, all possibilities exist, right, and this linear world, is absolutely essential, because any of the challenges that we seem to be facing now, like how do you get the solutions? And I rather than kind of don't really want to frame it problem solution because that's determined by the past, but what would be appropriate for the new civilization, as it were, if you ask that question, you know, in this domain of healthcare, energy generation, transport, whatever it is, you know, what would be appropriate that we could get those solutions or those ideas through from the field if we were able to, you know, navigate that space. So rather than us trying to do all this, you know, brain crunching and, you know, coming up with the next iteration of the electric car, which is still ultimately an industrial technology, if we were really to open up and go, well, you know, what are the other ways? Then do you believe that, you know, doing that would enable us to access the information we need to actually enable us to navigate, you know, gracefully into a future that kind of honors and respects all life?
Absolutely. As you were speaking, I was reminded of a film called Arrival, Amy Adams. I think it was done in 2016. And UAPs appear on the Earth, and she's a linguist.
Oh, yeah.
And so she's asked to come in to be able to learn their language and have them understand us as well. And what she found was that their language, they had no concept of time. And their language was circular. And they looked like octopi, you know, that was how they were envisioned by the writers. And they would shoot ink out of their hand and it would form this beautiful circle. And it was in the kind of the nuances of the circle that the concepts were embedded. And so they had no linear language. It was different. And I think, and what they were bringing was assistance. And we were not able to understand that. We were looking at it as if they were going to destroy the Earth. So I think it's an interesting analogy because we're opening ourselves up to something that simultaneously can terrify us because we don't understand it. We don't know what we're receiving. We don't even know what we're tapping into. What is it? Yet, if we allow ourselves to be in that space and to watch how the assistance that comes through our dreams and through synchronicities and meaningful correspondences, we understand that we're becoming informed by more than what we know. That's what we need to expand into. And it's not necessarily a thing. It's a field of information that can, my guess is, can offer us a whole lot of assistance and help us get out of our own way.
Yeah. And when they were pushing forth the circles, depending on the little nuances of the circles, that's where the information was. And that's why this new twisty theory of space-time is important, because it enables black hairs to appear on the edge of a black hole, which means you can get information out of the black hole. So that's why this new one is a little more interesting to me, because in theory there's nothing could escape from a black hole, but with this new twisty thing, so it's the same thing with the entities from Arrival. They're shooting out a circle of wholeness. If you're going from the ancient traditions with the 5 symbols, the circle was wholeness, but in that wholeness was embedded information if you could just understand it. And where you can understand it best is to get into the RIGPA, the non-conceptual thought-free original wakefulness. And if you're in that state, then you would be able to better understand the information available. And over the centuries, Tesla and various other people, items have been available to which would have helped us probably avoid some of the things that are going on with the code red issues at different times, and through patent blocking or whatever, buying things and not letting something go out. There was a movie one time about windshield wipers. This is going to sound like a little off the subject, but the whole movie was about the person that invented the intermittent windshield wiper. and he wanted to set up his own company, and one of the big companies said, let's just let us look at it to see if it's something that's safe enough to put in our car. We'll have to have one of them. And they got it, and then they kept him in court for decades, and all the cars started showing up with intermittent windshield wipers, and he eventually won a large suit. But there are things like that that are out there that have been squashed.
Mhm.
And I think with all the people Peter knows around the world, he probably knows of a few things that have been quashed and not
Yeah,
made into the system that would help us.
Well, the ability for us to do what the two of you have described, which is to be able to, like get our head out the way, as it were, and be able to ask in all humility, what it is we need to do, and be able to then have the ability to see it and then come back into this world and translate it, into something. I mean, it feels really simple at one level, but I think both of you would probably back this up. To do that work, often there's a bunch of stuff in ourselves, in our shadow, or related to our ego and attachment to separation or fear of death or whatever it is, that gets in the way of us being able to do that, right? So it's not just anybody can just show up and do it. There's a bunch of cleaning up that needs to happen first. Is that?
Yeah, in my training, I definitely, it's that back and forth again, where you have to release any thought that you know anything. You have to let that go, and you're only letting it go temporarily. It's for the means of reception, and then we come back into our self and our understanding of the world to process it and see how to integrate it into our world, how it fits. So we're using our rational, logical, reasoning mind to assist us. We can't just divorce ourselves from that aspect.
Yeah, it's like the master and the emissary.
To release. Pardon me, Peter?
Like that book, The Master and the Emissary. Was it Gilchrist?
Yes.
The master should be the heart and the intuition. The emissary should be the mind.
Correct.
We use to then work it through.
And they're inseparable in us. Yeah. We just haven't paid enough attention to the master, if you put it in those terms. Yeah.
Just to pick up a couple of questions here, Michael is asking, what about the I Ching? And I don't know if either of you are familiar with this saying, time is not of the essence, time is the essence. And then Michael qualifies it by saying, in other words, we are forms of nature, and nature including its eternal return, which includes time. Time is not of the essence, but time is the essence.
Time is the essence?
Time is not of the essence.
In my little world, of the non-conceptual, thought-free original wakefulness, part of it deals with conceptual and transcendent imputation. So any discussion of time, we're dealing with a concept of time. And I guess what I'm trying to do in my work is getting into a space where I'm not concerned with conceptual imputation about what my alters or any of the work I'm doing is going to do conceptually, but I'm trying to transcend that and offer back what it is I'm being asked to deliver on behalf of universal consciousness. So time is the essence in the sense that universal consciousness is the essence. It's just another aspect of it. But my whole work is identifying on a primordial grid what it is I'm being asked to deliver on a moment-by-moment basis. And I try to deliver that. And the reason Krista's been in my sacred room shooting photos of the last couple of days, the 700 objects in there all have jobs to do, and they're all part of my stash for delivering back what I'm supposed to deliver, because I've been identified as a caretaker for them right now. The singing bowl, the golden arrow, and all of the different items I have. I have a 17th century Black Madonna. So there's various things that I have been asked to caretake for a period of time, with the understanding that the sole purpose that I'm the caretaker is to give back to the timelessness or to the universal consciousness what it is it wants. And I think that's the way people need to operate. It's not on what can I take or what do I need, but what is it that you have been gifted with that you can give back to source. And then that's what you need to do, and you need to put yourself in a place where that consumes you, and that's what you do.
I think I haven't studied the I Ching, so I can't speak directly to that particular interpretation. But when I do work, I am traveling, I don't know, to different times. I'm receiving information about different times, but I'm not in a concept of time. I'm being shown imagery that dates itself, essentially, and but it's not dated. And so I would refer to that as an essence. It's like when we drop our concept or our human understanding, our material understanding of linear time, we move into the essence. And whether it be called time or pure awareness or pure, I don't even know if that's applicable, but I think that it's a very curious subject, and I'm really looking forward to discussing it at the Science and Consciousness Conference. I mean, we're having so many different points of view about what this is and what it can be. I don't think we need to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We just need to know what we're working with and how to work with it.
Catherine, thanks.
And I do use the I Ching when I'm running my altars. As you know, my master's degree is in contemplative brush from Naropa. So a lot of the paintings that I do are based on the I Ching, and I use the I Ching in some of the altars that I'm doing. In addition to other symbols that I'm using, there are certain symbols in the I Ching that are valuable for their frequencies on the altars I'm developing.
Catherine asks, could some inverted commas mental illness be an inability to function in linear time? So where people are having these non-linear experiences and can't work out how to integrate them into this linear time. Have either of you any experience?
I think that there is this aspect of already, I'm going to step out on a limb here. I'm not a scientist, a researcher, a psychiatrist, but I think that we all are on the spectrum somewhere. And some people are a little further at different areas, and it appears to us to be a disability and an inability to work in linear time or with material reality, when in fact they're just working with a different set of skills that make it difficult to work in our world. I don't know whether we term it as mental illness, and maybe if we become more sensitive to what it is that's coming through their understanding of the world, we might become more informed, and it might allow people to relax into the spectrum where they're actually working.
I would note someone mentions Dzogchen teachings here, and just so people can understand what that is, the 9th stage of Bon is Dzogchen, and the Buddhists basically, as they do in a lot of times when they wander into a country, took one of the indigenous folk religions and picked off Dzogchen, the great perfection, and developed the entire Dzogchen teachings. Unfortunately, they did bypass 7 and 8, which was casting a magic circle and introducing primordial shen or sound. And when I'm working on the primordial grid, what I'm doing on the 7th stage of the 9 stages of Bon teachings from the nameless religion, the priests of the nameless religion were called Bon. That's where the term came from. So what I'm doing on my grid is I put down a magic circle, and then I use my singing bowl to introduce primordial Shin, and only then can you reach Dzogchen, or the great perfection, which is where you do your work in a state of non-conceptual, thought-free, original wakefulness. So just to clear up the Dzogchen part of the teachings, it came from someplace else and bypassed the other 8 stages. I'll let it go there.
Thank you for that.
Unfortunately, I've been at this for 56 years with Buddhism and studied with lots of people and lots of lamas and everything, and audiences with, Panchen Lama, Dalai Lama, and various other people. And my conversations are a little different that other people have, based on the fact of the nameless religion teachings. They're very aware of and very interested to speak about it.
There's a question from Karoy, earlier saying, while I have written about and experienced simultaneous time, can the panel discuss body consciousness and its apparent relation to linear time, which seems to ignore simultaneous time as the body grows older at its own pace? So with all this non-linearity, we still seem to get older. But maybe there's something in the healing arts, that actually is about, when you connect through to the non-linearity, rejuvenating or regenerating the body. I don't know. Either of you any
Well,
thoughts?
my mother, who was 92, said she never felt like 92. So, she felt like she was 40, like she was. So I think there's also that idea is like our physical bodies are living linear time. I mean, you break an egg, you can't get that egg back together. You break your leg, we have to work within that framework or that paradigm, but our minds do not.
Yeah, Calen, I mean, you do quite a lot of healing work. Any reflections on kind of aging and how that relates to?
I noticed one about ayahuasca. I'm one of the odd ones. I'm 75 years old. I've never had a drink of alcohol or taken any mind-altering drugs, even though I made it through the 60s. So I was advised at a young age by a healer to keep a very clear path so that I could access some really strange stuff. So typically, I think I've accessed stranger stuff than people that were on the mind-altering drugs and the alcohol. But that's just my opinion, not knowing, since I never imbibed in any of that. So I thought that was an interesting question.
Wow.
And again, my work is highly theoretical, and I'm working on a different grid. So, if I've said something that doesn't relate to something someone is working with on this grid, I apologize, but it's just the fact that most of my work is done on this primordial grid. And I guess I have trouble sometimes explaining what the work is I do in this type of environment, for lack of a better explanation.
Great job. I think it's like this. Really, I see it as really this way of being able to connect the two worlds, the kind of invisible and visible realms, basically, and given the intelligence or insight, wisdom that exists in the universal field, how we bring that, how we kind of stay plugged into that, as it were, as we lead our linear lives. Seems to me that's the art and science that would be really good for all of us to learn. Just scrolling through to see if I can see any more questions. If we've forgotten one, then feel free to drop it back into the chat. Just on the twisty time thing, Calen, I was watching kind of Nassim Haramein's introductory course to all the stuff that he's doing, and in that they talk about torque, and it seems to be related to it. I'm trying to see if I can find the quote, but basically the idea was that the torque causes the spin, and in kind of my understanding of volution, torque in that context, what causes the spin, which is the process of manifestation coming out of the universal field, is a tension between present and possible, or present and potential, right? That when we're holding, in terms of the way manifestation or intention works, is when we're holding the present and we're holding another possibility, that creates a tension. It's interesting that intention is so related to the word tension, and that creates a pull on the information field, as it were, that then starts this whole spinning process that is what the torus is about, into manifestation. So that twist is very core to the whole concept of spin and volution, and torque is like the force that's exerted on the field, as it were, to initiate or trigger that twisty experience. But it seems very close to what Nassim's been discovering in his whole physics model.
And you're dealing with vibration and frequency. So when I'm designing an algorithm for one of the alters, you're trying to increase the spin quotient with the particular sounds that you're using, the primordial shin. Those sounds that you're using can accelerate or decelerate the movement of energy coming from a particular set of ritual objects, because they all have their own spin. So if I drop 15 ritual objects on an altar, I need to know what each one of them is spinning at in relation to the geometric configuration, and then design an algorithm with a singing bowl that introduces a sound that allows them all to do their work and simultaneously to reach the objective of the altar. So that's the spin quotient is extremely important in the twistiness.
It seems like the sound is basically what does that transfer, right, from the invisible into the visible. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, the Yorkshire thing is the best example, I think, that you would know about. We were trying to connect a genesis point to the Broughton sanctuary where our retreat's going to be, and Peter and I drove like 45 minutes north of Broughton in the middle of nowhere and walked across the dales and went across a couple of rivers to identify this tiny little spot that Peter's Google Earth map with all of the energy lines and everything. There was this tiny little spot, and I dropped one of my altars really quick, and the moment I sounded the altar, we went from no cell phone connection to 4 bars of 5G, and both of our phones pinged from someone back at Broughton wanting to know what we were doing at the exact same moment. So that was the sound. All of that potential was there in that spot for the information to come out and be dispersed to where it needed to be dispersed. And then introducing the sound was what connected the grid.
Yeah, exactly. It was right at that moment that you hit the bowl. Yeah. Cool. Well, I just put the link into what Calen referred to there, the Google Earth energies, if anybody's interested. And that's a download, by the way, a layer download for Google Earth you can put onto Google Earth. And we've just at Ubiquity, while we're doing this, we'll have a little promotional break here. At Ubiquity, we've just created a place where you can go and get Humanity Rising t-shirts. So go and tell the world about Humanity Rising. Also, there are Chartres t-shirts in there and stuff as well. You can get an HR t-shirts and things. So if you guys aren't going to ask questions, I'm just going to spam you with promotional ads. So so that's where you can do that. And Science and Consciousness in the UK is the 19th to the 23rd of November, in person. A really cool group of people. Some of the, obviously all the people who are on this week are coming, but quite a lot more also, all of whom have been exploring this whole question of time. So here's the link to that if anybody can make that. If you're in the UK, or Europe, obviously that's easier because it's from the US, it's further, and it's around Thanksgiving, I think, comes just straight afterwards, so it's a bit tight. There is a discount running this week, 20% off if you use that code SCIENCE20. So, which link was it? Calen, there's a link people said doesn't work. Which one was that? Did you put a link in, Calen, to something? Oh, the Monk Library. Oh, it's because there's 4 W's. It should just be 3 W's. I'll put it in the chat here. So, what app opens the download? Oh, for the Earth energies, you have to download the file and then you have to open Google Earth. So you need to make sure you've downloaded Google Earth, and then you can just import the Earth energies file. And it basically, it's like you're looking at the light body of the Earth. It's amazing. It like just has all these lines, all these grids, all the different sacred sites and things. So feel free to check that out. And at what we're doing at Broughton, and where we're doing a lot of this research as well, is the weird experience, which is where we've got all this equipment across from Princeton, where they did a lot of really interesting research around the nature of consciousness and time and things as well. So I'll put the chat in there as well. You can see what we're doing at Go Weird and the weird research, get the latest info there. And if you're, we're trying to reawaken, as I said, this weird meme as a way of reawakening that sense of interconnectedness. So we're being very playful with that. We've got, like, this is the weirdo t-shirt, but we got a t-shirt that says something like, "Stare here, make me look." You know, this Rupert Sheldrake thing about the sense of being stared at, so that you can play with staring, you know, seeing if you can make people turn around when they're wearing the t-shirt and that as well. So, somebody says promote the weird shirts here. There you go. Go to the weird store and get your weird merch. So good. Well, that was a good little promotional moment. But as it is, it's all about getting the word out there. So
if you come to the conference, you can walk by 16-meter labyrinth that I have at Broughton, which has exactly 555 stones that were dowsed sequentially to bring you to the state of Rigpa. So that's an added blessing over there, is that you can walk a 555 stone labyrinth.
Yeah, and they've just installed a, as if you've been listening to Kirsty the last couple of days, she has helped them to get installed a float tank. And if you want to do some experiments around, you know, losing track of linear time, the float tank is a really good way to do that. You know, Calen has referenced Broughton a lot, so I just put the chat in there so you can check it out. It's an amazing location. The energy is incredible, and there's as well as the labyrinth. There's the whole weird experience there, where you can go in and interact with your mind with all of these devices without being physically connected to them at all, and have the float tank experience as well. So if you can't make it to Science and Consciousness, but you are going to the UK at some point, go up to Broughton anyway and check it out. Good. Well, thank you, Calen and Krista. That was very enlightening. And it's really clear to me now, this kind of navigation of the two worlds, really, the linear, non-linear, the in-time and out-time world, the universal awareness and the kind of world of knowledge, and how we can, the art, I think, you know, for humanity now is learning to be able to navigate those worlds. And I think if we do that, everything that we've thought of as a problem up until now, boom, you know, kind of gone, because the answers are there. You know, whatever we need is there if we're able to ask really clearly and humbly. And like you said, Krista, you've got to let go of anything you think you know. So there's a surrender, right? There's a surrender to, and a complete humility to, okay, well, you know, what needs to happen? Boom, there it is. And then it still requires, what do they call it? Skillful means to be able to take that in and bring it into the material world. So all the other things we do, you know, around leadership, holistic leadership, you know, agile governance, you know, effective communication, that doesn't nullify any of that. In fact, all we need to get our skillful means as skillful as possible, so that they're as aligned with this kind of holistic approach as much as possible, so that when we do get it through, we're able to implement it in a way that is aligned with these kind of natural intelligence as much as possible. But very exciting and very hopeful. You know,
and I think the aha moment is classic in science, and where somebody's been working on a problem for years, and then suddenly the answer drops in, or it comes in through a dream, and then it solves the problem. You know, so it's not just it is very practically oriented as well.
Yeah, yeah. And there's a little kind of slight late conversation going on here about relationship between intuition and logic. And I think, you know, Krista, like you were sharing, the intuition brings it in, and then the logic works out how do we implement it in this kind of material reality and this seemingly relative reality. So like I was saying at the beginning, it's not an either or in any way. It's how we reintegrate our kind of intuitive understanding, as it were, to be able to connect the two. And then everything tends to flow a lot more gracefully. And so as somebody asked early on, well, how do you relate this to Code Red? It's just because we've forgotten. You know, we cut ourselves off from that intuitive beingness in interconnectedness, and kind of then everything else wobbles, because the rest is then completely out of context, doesn't have any roots, is completely ungrounded. And as we heal that split, we then get access again to the natural intelligences, or the invisible world, in a way that will allow us to integrate the two. And I think I used this quote the other day, which is one of my favorites, from Ken Wilber. He says, when the great mother is repressed, the great goddess is concealed. So when we've repressed our relationship to earth, the feminine, the childlike, and everything else, then we don't get given access to, like, you know, the cool stuff, because that could be really dangerous. So we have to heal that split first, reintegrate our relationship to the great mother, which then gives us access to the great goddess. And interesting, he uses those terms, if you think about the model I had earlier, because those are both the yin based, have the yin as the foundation, and then the middle is the kind of more rational yang thing. So the work is becoming clearer, like what the work is, I think, and you two have helped us, I think, to understand it, explain it from both practice and concepts really usefully. So thanks very much. There is the after chat, as everybody probably knows by now. I think we've been dropping in the links, so anybody who can make that, you're very welcome. And tomorrow we have the last in the series, and we'll be with Paula Petri, who is looking at how we've got kind of trapped in this linear time and how we can get out of it. And a lot of her work is working as a shaman in traveling through time in different ways. So we'll be exploring her experience of that, and I think it'll tie in very well to what we discussed today. So thanks everyone for joining. Thank you again, Krista and Calen.
Welcome. Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome. We will see you tomorrow. Bye, bye, bye. Don't forget, stay weird, go weird, be weird.